Okay, so we're moving on to the second section of the migration topic. So you may remember in the first section we were largely looking at describing the composition of migration and describing where migrants are moving from and to, and things like that. Things like interregional migration. So section 2 of the topic is looking at how and why migration has become more complex, meaning that historically people moved in quite specific patterns from certain countries to other countries, and certain types of people, certain demographics of people were doing that movement. Whereas recently, in the last 100 years or so, the people who are moving have changed in composition, and where they're moving from and to has also changed. Okay, so key ideas are the global migration patterns are influenced by a multitude of interrelated factors, okay? And we're going to look at what those factors are, why people are moving. So a process referred to as economic globalization is leading to new sources and new host countries. What that really means is globalization is the interconnection of different countries through things like internet and air travel and all of this type of thing. And so this is what's meaning that new countries are becoming wealthy, and therefore people are moving from and to different countries. Okay, so first of all, have a bit of a think. Where do you think the big migrant routes are, and why are people taking these journeys? So what migrant routes are you aware of? Some of them we've sort of learnt about during this topic. So here we've got, this is just sort of some of the migrant routes. So having to think about what's driving some of these, what's making these happen. So we've got a couple of areas to draw your attention to. So the yellow area and the blue area. So this is where there's freedom of movement. So with the yellow area is the EU. So we've got free movement between those countries. And then the blue area is a very similar arrangement in South America. It's called Mercosur, and it's very much the same as the EU, where you can move freely within them. So that's going to obviously encourage and allow a lot of movement, particularly from areas of low wages and low wealth to areas of higher wages and higher wealth. Okay, similar things are occurring here. So Australia has sort of a major situation with migration, so particularly from places like sort of Southeast Asia, essentially moving into Australia. And Australia is quite hardline, sort of against having lots of migration. They're really quite tough on people moving into the area. You have to sort of go through a points system to be allowed to move into the country. We've also got, say, people from America moving to the UK. So this is an example potentially, and we'll sort of see some of this later in this lesson, of what we might call sort of like return migration. So people who maybe their parents or their parents' parents had themselves moved to America, and then people are potentially moving back to the UK, and we see that within people's lifetime. So within Europe, people have moved from Poland to Western Europe and other Eastern countries for work, and then a few years later they're moving back again. So anyway, some points here. So choose 3 routes and explain why people are migrating between those countries. So choose some of these. I've talked about a couple of them. So why are people moving between these specific places? So something to think about. So what's the link between these two areas? What connects these two that I've just circled there? So what's the connection between them? And you can think about this for any of these. Another one that would be quite a good one to look at. So here from Mexico to the USA, so that's a good one to explain. So why are people moving from that one to that one? So how do we think patterns of migration have changed in the past 100 years? Because this is kind of what this section is about, increasing complexity. So how has migration become more complex? I mean, the clue in terms of what's changed is in the title of the lesson. It's obviously become more complex, but can you think of ways in which that has happened? Can you have any places that have become major sources of migrants and places that have become major hosts, and what has caused this change to happen? Okay. So some of the changes that have occurred is things that we might not be super aware of where we live, but say particularly in this region of Asia that I've just circled, much like places like Europe experienced during the Industrial Revolution, because parts of Asia are going through an Industrial Revolution, or even more at the tail end of that, you've got a great disparity between level of development within Asia. So you've got some countries that have really well developed economies and are making lots of money through secondary and tertiary services that they're performing. And then you've got other countries which are far more agricultural and lower paid wages. So because of that disparity of wealth, you've got a lot of migration happening within the area. Whereas if you went back, say, 100 years, the countries would be more similar in terms of development, so they'd be less likely to have major movement. So that's a bit of an example. So just looking at globalization and migration. So globalization, this first bullet point, countries have become increasingly interdependent. So that's basically what globalization is. So this increased complexity that we're talking about is due to migration. So this has strengthened the traditional, what are called bilateral migrant corridors. So bilateral means basically it moves from one country to another. So it moves between two countries. So a good example of a bilateral corridor would be from Mexico to America. It's a very distinct, people are moving from one country to the other. But we've also got new corridors emerging, and we'll look at some of those today. So have a think, do you know what this place is? We've got a kind of this, at the bottom is what it used to look like, and the top is what it looks like now. So this is Dubai. And the reason that this is important is that Dubai has grown really, really rapidly. And to facilitate that growth has required a huge workforce. So to build all of these buildings that you can see at the top here requires a huge number of construction workers. And so many of those construction workers have been hired from elsewhere, from abroad. So they've moved into the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, from other countries, primarily within Asia. Okay, so this is an example of contemporary migration patterns. So we're looking at some of these new patterns of migration, and this is interregional. So inter is between regions. So to be clear on why it's between regions, we can sort of draw a bit of a line roughly here. So on one side of the line over this side, we've got the Middle East. And sort of going into Africa and Europe, and then on this side we've got Asia. So that's sort of the distinction between the two regions. That's why it's interregional. So later we will look at movement within Southeast Asia, and that will be intra-regional. Okay, so we've got these arrows showing where people are moving from, going to UAE, which is where the city of Dubai is found. So they're moving in from places like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. So back in 2013, the UAE had the 5th largest stock of in the world of migrants, with 7.8 million migrants out of a total population of 9.3 million. So only 15% of people living in the United Arab Emirates are what are called Emirati, as in people who would be considered to be sort of native people living within the country. Okay, so 85% of the population are migrants within the UAE, which is, we all sort of learn as we look at this little section, but basically the Emirati are extremely wealthy, a lot of them, and to support that wealth and to facilitate them being wealthy requires a quite major kind of lower class to exist, and they've essentially had that lower class migrate in from other countries. So 90% of the workforce is international migrants, and as I've said, this is where they're coming from. And they're basically attracted by a demand for labour. There's lots of work in the UAE, there's loads of jobs available, and it's important word here, relatively high wages. What that means is that if you're coming from, say, rural Bangladesh, you're quite possibly in a situation of poverty. You've basically got very, very little money. So your job in Dubai, in UAE, might be, by our standards, very low paid. But from the perspective of coming from an impoverished agricultural area of some part of Asia, it may be seen as quite a good job, potentially. Now, there's a lot of issues around this. So I'll attach a document, and what I want you to do is read through this sheet about Dubai, a city of temporary migrants. This is a news article, and there's some questions on the second page of it, and I want you to have a go at answering those questions. Okay, so this is the idea of this is to give you a bit of an insight into the fact that there's actually quite a lot of human rights violations happening in Dubai around this, and this plays really well with the section that we've just done about how migration can lead to injustices. So I've highlighted the term injustices in the question just to make you aware that that's kind of something, a really good example you can talk about if you're answering a question about whether migration can lead to positives or negatives. You can sort of discuss those injustices. Okay, so moving on, this is another example of contemporary migration patterns. This time it's intra-regional, so within a region. So we're looking at people moving from LIDCs, lower income developing countries in Southeast Asia, to and within what's called ASEAN member states. So a lot of these countries are within what's called the ASEAN group, and that's why they can move more freely. So ASEAN, highlighted over here, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So again, sort of a similar grouping like the EU. Not going to be exactly the same, but you'll find groupings like the EU all around the world. So where countries have joined together to form a larger group. Okay, so we've got a rapid increase in migrant stock among ASEAN member states, so primarily moving from the less economically developed or lower income developing countries within the ASEAN group to the wealthier economies. So you've got places like Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand that are becoming quite wealthy. So that's a recent change, and that's leading to people moving into those countries. So places like Myanmar, which is here, and Laos, Cambodia, these are the big sources. So these are the poorer countries within the region, and they're moving to places like Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand. So sorts of jobs these people are doing, I mean, they're largely low skilled, they're often undocumented, meaning they haven't got an actual right to work necessarily, and they're seeking employment and they're looking for kind of higher wages in these other countries. So what kind of jobs would you expect these people to do? They're low skilled and they don't have documentation. So have a bit of a think, what sorts of jobs might they end up doing? So this is just a bit of a way of representing the data of the migrant stock in these different countries. This is the origin of the migrants who are in these countries. So having a look at these charts, what do you think maybe is the kind of socio-economic status of each country? So which one is sort of doing better than others? So a bit of a clue here is just how many people living in Singapore have moved there from Malaysia, suggesting that Malaysia is likely to be of a lower economic development than Singapore because of people moving from Malaysia to Singapore. And then there's not a lot of crossover between Thailand and Malaysia, so there's not much of a clue there necessarily as to who is moving from where. And the likelihood is that the people moving in is largely due to convenience. So Indonesia and Malaysia are quite closely linked geographically, as are Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar linked to Thailand. So it's just easy to travel between those. Okay, so the next one we're looking at is again intra-regional. This is in South America. So we've got an area that's called the Southern Cone. This is an area of Argentina, Chile, Paraguay and Uruguay. So it's sort of, so this bit here essentially. So people are moving from the higher area down into the Southern Cone. Okay, and the main reason is disparity in wages and labour opportunities. So you may or may not be aware, but places like Venezuela have had major issues in recent years. They're a communist country, very much making their money from oil, and as oil prices have fluctuated and as internal issues in the country have happened, the country has basically started to fall apart. So people are leaving to find better work. Similarly, Brazil has had issues as well. And so they moved down to this sort of Southern Cone area where they feel like they're going to have a much better opportunity of getting a good job. Okay. Also, as I mentioned, this Mercosur group, much like the EU, allows free movement. So because of that, people can move from somewhere like Venezuela, which is up here, and like I said, they're moving down into the Southern Cone, again from Brazil into the Southern Cone, all because of disparity in wages. And the agreement here, the Mercosur agreement, is reducing intervening obstacles. So when we thought about the Lee's model of migration, one of the intervening obstacles would be borders, and these borders have essentially been removed by freedom of movement. Okay, this is obviously creating problems within the region, much like there have been problems as we looked at for, say, countries like Poland and Latvia losing a lot of their young fit workers. These places are going to be experiencing brain drain and other problems because of their loss of migrants. So we've also got a bit on internal migration. So this is particularly prominent, as you'll see, in or we've noticed it far more in large countries. So places like India, China, Brazil. These are the size of areas, you know, like potentially like Europe. So we've got people moving within these countries, and they're largely going to be moving from rural areas to urban areas. This is due to what's called FDI, often foreign direct investment. This is basically money coming in from abroad. So when a car factory, for example, opens, that's going to attract people who maybe have a low paying job or don't have a job living in an agricultural area, and they're going to be moving in to a city to try and make more money. So I've given an example here of, say, like China has a lot of mobile phone factories, like the Apple factory over there, and people will move to the region to get jobs. And what you tend to find is that factories kind of are based close together. This is called agglomeration economies, and that's because you've got a workforce that is there, and so more and more factories appear in that same region. So a bit of a summary. So an increase in the number of countries and their economies have become independent or interdependent even. This increases the complexity of global migration, and it's very much linked to globalization. And the major bilateral corridors and traditional migration partnerships have remained strong, but we've got new additional movements occurring. So see if you can answer these questions. So to recap again, interregional, two regions moving from one to the other. Intra-regional, moving within the region. Okay, so we've got 1, 2. Okay, ASEAN, remember what that stands for? Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so much like the EU, but down in Southeast Asia. And why might migrants avoid the UEA in future? That should say UAE. So UEA is the university. So why might migrants avoid the UAE in future? So because they've been treated poorly by employers, and they've had passports taken away, and they've ended up in sort of forced labour situations, and that was all in the document that you were reading earlier.